Welcome to English Story Hub. Learn English through fun stories. Improve vocabulary, listening, and speaking skills. Like, subscribe, and keep learning with us.
Hitler Studies. A Field of Amateurs. Part 2. Hamann's work provides a healthy and necessary corrective to the works of many professional historians. In conducting her research, Hamann also noted the names of many people whose existence had long been known to historians, but who had never been interviewed. One such man, for example, roomed with Hitler in Munich in 1913–14. Of course, by the time Hamann did her research, this man was dead, and she could only interview his surviving relatives. But the point is that few professional historians until Hamann half a century after Hitler's death did what one would expect them to do, namely, locate, interview, check, and evaluate the sources. Thus, the field of Hitler studies is considerably poorer because of the failure of professional historians to carry out their first duty, that of collecting and preserving the evidence. Further, they waited for historians from outside the field to even begin the most elementary evaluation of sources. When one hears professional historians claiming that Hitler is inexplicable because of the lack of evidence 19, one should ask, what did professional historians do to locate the witnesses and to gather their testimony while they were still alive? Why did they uncritically accept sensational testimony without performing the most elementary evaluation of its accuracy, reliability, and credibility? Unfortunately, the field of Hitler studies has been a field for amateurs. 2. Evading the historical problem of Hitler. The charge of evasion is not a new one. In fact, it was first raised as early as 1953 by the man who is often called the Dean of Hitler Studies, H.R. Treverroper. 8 years after Hitler's death, Treverroper published an essay entitled The Mind of Adolf Hitler, in which he accused historians of evading the two unanswered questions that constitute the problem with Hitler. Those two unanswered questions are: 1. Who was this man? And 2. How did he do it? In the first paragraph, Treverroper starkly charges historians with evading both. Who was Hitler? The history of his political career is abundantly documented, and we cannot escape from its terrible effects. A whole generation may well be named in history after him, and we shall speak of the age of Hitler as we speak of the age of Napoleon or the age of Charlemagne. And yet, for all the harsh obviousness of its imprint on the world, how elusive his character remains. What he did is clear, every detail of his political activity is now thanks to a seizure and exploitation of documents unparalleled in history historically established. His daily life and personal behavior have been examined and exposed. But still, when asked not what he did but how he did it, or rather how he was able to do it, historians evade the question, sliding away behind implausible answers. Treverroper then goes on to offer a list of the implausible theories given by historians, which have changed little in half a century. To the Marxists most old-fashioned of all, he was simply a pawn, the creature of a dying capitalism in its last stages. Others have seen him as a charlatan profiting by a series of accidents, a consummate actor and hypocrite, a sly, cheating peasant, or a hypnotist who seduced the wits of men by a sorcerer's charms. Even Sir Louis Namia endorses an account of him given by a disgusted German official as a mere illiterate, illogical, unsystematic bluffer and smatterer. Even Mr. Bullock seems content to regard him as a diabolical adventurer animated solely by an unlimited lust for power. Charms. Even Sir Louis Namia endorses an account of him given by a disgusted German official as a mere illiterate, illogical, unsystematic bluffer and smatterer. Trevor Roper insists that these are not explanations but evasions, negative labels that explain nothing. In dismay he asks, could a mere adventurer, a shifty, scatterbrained charlatan, have done what Hitler did, who, starting from nothing, nearly conquered the whole world? But in answer to his question, Trevor Roper is met only by the silence of statues. So we ask, writes Trevor Roper, but we seldom receive an answer. The historians have turned away, and, he adds, sardonically, like antique heroes, we only know that we have been talking with the immortals from the fact that they are no longer there. In other words, in the face of Hitler, like a Medusa, historians have turned to stone. After Trevor Roper's charge of evasion, one might have expected an avalanche of articles contesting his charges, and a multitude of new biographies of Hitler to come from the pens of professional historians in order to prove him wrong. Instead, one was met with, as Trevor Roper suggested, the silence of statues. One searches in vain for an article denying the charge, and equally in vain to find a professional historian writing a coherent biography of Hitler that truly addresses the questions Trevor Roper raised. A review of the major biographies published in the first half-century after Hitler's death amply confirms Trevor Roper's charge. Prior to 1953, there were only two post-war biographies of Hitler that could be called major, well-researched works. The first of these was Alan Bullock's Hitler, a study in tyranny, published in 1952, the year before Trevor Roper's accusation, and, indeed, the work that provoked Trevor Roper to make it. The second was Walter Gollitz and Herbert A. Quint's Adolf Hitler, Ein Biography, also published in 1952. Gollitz and Quint's biography was as much on Trevor Roper's mind as Bullock's. In the next 45 years after Trevor Roper made his charges against professional historians, there have been only 3 other major biographies of Hitler that are worthy of mention as new, significant, in-depth, scholarly, well-researched, and complete attempts to write a narrative history of this man. These are 1. William L. Shire's The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich, published in 1960, 2. Joachim Fest's Hitler, published in 1973, and 3. John Toland's Adolf Hitler, published in 1976. What is astonishing about this list is that of these 5 biographies, including Bullock and Gollitz and Quint, only one of their authors, Bullock, is, or was at the time of writing, a professional historian. For a long time after World War II, the only major biography written by and for Germans was Görlitz and Quint's Adolf Hitler, eine Biographie. Görlitz and Quint, however, were simply two amateur historians who wrote under pseudonyms. Görlitz's true name was Otto Julius Freundorf, while Quint's was Richard Freiherr v. Frankenberg. Both were Pomeranian conservatives whose only qualification was that their hobby was military history. Freundorf and von Frankenberg jumped into a field vacated by the professionals to provide a young generation of Germans coming of age after the war with the only post-war biography of the man who was responsible for the destruction they saw all around them. Freundorf later went on to a successful career in journalism. One might ask, where were all the academic historians who occupy prestigious chairs of history at universities? The answer is, they were sitting at their desks drawing very good salaries and dreaming of an inexplicable Hitler who would absolve them of their obligation to write history. The first major biography of Hitler to appear after Trevor Roper made his charge of evasion against professional historians was William A. Schirer's The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich. Schirer, too, was not a professional historian. Rather, like Freundorf, he was a journalist turned amateur historian. Schirer had been an American correspondent in Berlin in the 1930s covering Hitler after he came into power. In 1943, he published the memoirs of his experiences as Berlin Diary, the Journal of a Foreign Correspondent 1934 to 1941. In the preface of The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich, Schirer records his reasons for becoming an amateur historian. A review of them amply confirms the charge of evasion made by Trevor Roper. It is worth quoting Schirer at length for the light he sheds on the attitudes of the professional historians he encountered when he began his biography. Though I lived and worked in the Third Reich, Schirer explains, during the first half of its brief life, watching at first hand Adolf Hitler consolidate his power, this personal experience would not have led me to attempt this book had there not occurred at the end of World War II an event unique in history. This was the capture of the most confidential archives of the German government and all its branches. The National Socialist Party and Heinrich Himmler's secret police. Never before, I believe, has such a rich treasure fallen into the hands of contemporary historians. Yet never, Schirer writes, had such a rich treasure been so completely ignored by professional historians. Had they researched the documents and written scholarly biographies explaining the times and events, Schirer would never have attempted to compete with them and rested content on his journalistic memoirs. But where such a rich treasure was being positively shunned by the professional historians, Schirer explains, it felt right to the journalist in him to walk where the angels of the historical profession feared to tread, and to tell the story as he saw it. Schirer also recorded the arguments made by professionals to discourage him from writing a biography of Hitler, arguments that surprised Schirer as much as they would have surprised Theodor Mommsen. Schirer portrays the crustiness of professional historians by detailing the rationalizations they employed to argue against writing a biography of Hitler. He refers first to those professionals who advised him that this unique cache of documents and materials should be not examined at all, but left to a later generation of writers. Most historians, they argued to him, waited 50 years, or 100, or more, before attempting to write an account of a country, an empire, or an era. But, Shira asks in reply, was this not principally because it took that long for the pertinent documents to come to light and furnish them with the authentic materials they needed? In the case of Hitler, the materials were already present and were begging to be studied, but the professional historians insisted that no attempt should be made to weave them into a historical narrative. Next, Shira felt that he had to defend himself against those professionals who insisted that historians had to wait decades before writing in order to gain perspective. To this objection he replies, and though perspective was gained, was not something lost because the authors necessarily lacked a personal acquaintance with the life and atmosphere of the times and with the historical figures about which they wrote. But the professional historians were unconvinced and, like Trevor Roper's antique heroes, turned away. Finally, against all the professionals, Shira quotes one of the first and greatest historians, Thucydides, who prefaced his history of the Peloponnesian War with this clinching justification for writing history fresh. I lived through the whole war. Thucydides writes, being of an age to comprehend events and giving my full attention to them in order to know the exact truth about them. Modern historians, Shira implies, were either not of an age to comprehend events or did not want to know the exact truth about them. In any event, Shira argues, the third reach is a unique case, and he, for one, though not a professional historian, would not wait 50 years, or 100, or more, to research and write history about a time he had personally lived through and experienced, especially when such incomparable sources were available. Shira's book was published in 1960 and was received by both the public and reviewers in the United States like rain after a drought. It was a great success and was rapidly translated and published with great fanfare to a European public equally thirsty for historical understanding. Shira's book also coincided with the capture and trial of Adolf, which sparked an even greater interest in the mystery of Hitler and the Nazi period. The 1960s became known as the beginning of the Hitler Well or Hitler Wave, a period of intense public fascination with Hitler, marked by an avalanche of sensational biographies by non-historians and popular books, articles, plays, television programs, films, and documentaries on the Nazi period. Nonetheless, Shira's narrative, like Mazur's research, was not warmly received by academic historians. Shira's view was that Hitler was just another world conqueror in the same vein as Caesar or Napoleon. While the professionals disagreed with this assessment, they did not act to provide any new or better narrative. Rather, professional historians were content to offer little but specialized studies of aspects of Hitler's career and the Nazi period. The only two notable exceptions were Helmut Heiber's Adolf Hitler. Eine Biographie, 1960, which offered insightful passages, but little more than the same conventional explanations of Hitler that Trevor Roper had criticized as evasions, and Ernst Duerlain's Hitler. Eine politische Biographie, 1960, which, although still considered to be the best short Hitler biography, was too short to weave together any new, comprehensive narrative into the facts. By the end of the 1960s, therefore, the public was all but clamoring for a comprehensive, scholarly biography by a professional historian. But they were not to get it. Instead, what they got was the most definitive biography of Hitler, Joachim Fest's Hitler, published in 1973. But this also, like Schirer's work 13 years before, was not written by an academic historian. Fest began his career as a radio and television reporter who went on to become one of Germany's leading journalists. At the time of writing Hitler, he was a member of the editorial board of the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung. Fest's biography was a huge success, and Fest went on to become one of Germany's leading historians. But he broke into the club by doing what the academics and practicing professionals had failed to do. Nor did Fest's biography solve Hitler or meet Mommsen's criterion of a narrative. Instead, Fest evaded the problem by simply placing Hitler outside of history. History records no phenomenon like him, and declaring him to be an unperson whose personality scarcely arouses our interest. 2 years later, surveying the attempts of historians to come to grips with this unperson, Fritz Stern, a German professor of literature, sadly concluded that historians were simply baffled. As we go down the list of the more important biographers, we find each more meticulous than his predecessor in the sifting of fact from fiction, of documented evidence from inference and interpretation, yet there is a point at which it is apt to defeat its own purpose, which I take to be an understanding of history. A montage of historical minutiae does not necessarily lead to better insight. More details often entail less sense. The facts of the case, chief among them the metamorphosis of the nobody from Vienna into the leader of Greater Germany, are so extraordinary that when they are left to tell their own story, they hardly make any sense at all, emphasis added. Thus by 1975, 30 years after Hitler's death, it was still the considered judgment of scholars that historians had failed to weave the facts into a coherent narrative. But not even Stern's judgment provoked professional historians into action. The next major biography, John Toland's Adolf Hitler, 1976, not by a professional historian either. Toland was a budding playwright, short story author, and novelist who fell into writing history at the age of 45 by accident or by fate, as he tells. In his autobiography, Captured by History, One Man's Vision of Our Tumultuous Century, 1997. Toland admits from the beginning that he had no storyline with which to tie together the facts of Hitler's life into a narrative. My book has no thesis, he writes, except that Hitler was far more complex and contradictory than I had imagined. Toland, therefore, merely piles fact upon fact, but at least admits that, as Fritz Stern had said, they hardly make any sense at all. By the end of the 1970s, therefore, more than a third of a century after Hitler's death, that there were only 5 major scholarly biographies of Hitler: Bullock's, Görlitz and Quint's, Shiras, Fest's, and Toland's, only one of which, Alan Bullock's Hitler, A Study in Tyranny, 1952, was written by a professional historian. After Bullock, professional and academic historians merely confirmed Trevor Roper's charge. They continued to evade the issue, leaving the field to amateurs. As a result, the field of Hitler studies became littered with dozens of sensational and amateurish, as well as conventional biographies of Hitler. Psychologists were having a field day, with explanations of Hitler that included everything from a goat biting his penis to theories of monarchism and an overprotective mother. But, in the absence of historians doing their duty, the mystery only intensified. At about this time, another amateur historian seized the opportunity to enter the field that professional historians left vacant and began rooting through the documents, sometimes coming up with well-researched, and at other times presenting poorly researched, amateurish, politicized, and highly controversial results. This was David Irving, who, while not attempting a new biography of Hitler, built a career on showing that many professional historians had not done their homework. Word slowly began to percolate into the minds of professional historians that something was amiss. By the 1980s, professional historians finally began to enter the field, not with comprehensive biographies of Hitler, but with studies of his personality and footnotes to his character. But these only heightened the mystery. A consciousness began dawning among professional historians that the problem with Hitler could no longer be swept under the rug. Thus there broke out in Germany in the mid-1980s one of the most remarkable debates in the history of scholarship. This was the Historikerstreit, a prolonged and bitter debate among professional historians that flew far beyond the normal orbit of academic journals and landed in the popular media, inviting amateur historians as well as the general public to participate.